What's up, guys? What you're about to watch is a clip from a live stream I did over the weekend where I went point by point and I refuted this very racist Reddit post. I've decided to dedicate one day a week to live streaming on my second channel, Underzealots. So if you like what I do over on my main channel, but don't want to have to wait a month between releases and want to just see me talk about things off the cuff, tune into one of the live streams, subscribe to the second channel, and let me know what you want to see me cover. Anyway, enjoy the video. It's a long one. It's kind of blood boiling, but it's informative. So this iceberg was sent to me by someone over email, and they requested that I tackle it live on stream, talk about it, and that's what we're gonna do today. Okay, it's a ridiculous iceberg. It's disgusting. It's extremely fucking racist, but what is to be expected when we're dealing with Zionists, right? Ethno-supremacists. So let's just cut right to the chase and do it. Layer 1, tip of the iceberg, under occupation, Nakba, poor and oppressed. Yes. I assume, like, when it comes to these memes, the tip of the iceberg is supposed to represent, like, uncontroversial things that everybody just takes for granted or assumes. And then, like, the premise of these memes is, like, the deeper you go, like, you unlock actual knowledge on the topic. And then when you're at the bottom, you're radiating with actual knowledge or some shit. I'm way too old and way too much of a boomer and way too offline to know how to explain these fucking memes, but I'm familiar with them loosely. So that's what they are for anyone who is like me and old and a boomer and a diehard grass toucher. That's what these memes do, okay? So the top layer says under occupation, Nakba, poor and oppressed, which is pretty uncontroversial. People know this. It's true. Poor and oppressed is kind of like a condescending way to talk about it. I wouldn't really say it that way. I would use the term oppression because at the very least in an academic framework, this is an instance where you could definitely use the term oppression, but just the way this is said, poor and oppressed, is like, whatever. I'm thinking too far into it. Layer 2, allied with Russia, Iran, and China. This is very clearly just guilt by association bullshit. It's not unreasonable, by the way, for some Palestinians to seek out relations with Iran, which is, one of the main forces that actually puts up a fight against their tormentors. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's a maxim. It's a maxim that Zionists have also abided by in far worse ways than allying with Iran, which I don't particularly take massive umbrage with. I think there's plenty of countries that are a lot worse to ally with, Israel being foremost among them. Where was I? Yes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Guilt by association stuff. Okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's a maxim that Zionists have abided by. There were factions of Zionists in Mandatory Palestine who sought out tactical relations with Nazis and fascists to combat the British because they saw British occupation of Palestine as a greater threat to them than Nazism. Seriously. And I'm not referring to the 1933 Havara Agreement right now. I'm referring to the fact that when the Irgun came to a truce with the British during the mandatory period and they turned their efforts toward fighting the Axis, an offshoot of the Irgun called the Lehi, which was headed by a dude named Abraham Stern, refused to honor the truce, and he actively sought an alliance with the Nazis and with fascist Italy because he perceived the 1939 White Paper, which the British issued in order to restrict Jewish migration to Palestine out of concerns for the tensions that migration was causing on the ground. The Stern gang viewed that white paper as an obstacle to Jewish independence and therefore something worth allying with Nazis and fascists over, right? So if we're going to do the guilt by association argument, that shit goes both ways. And also, the way it's being applied right now to Palestinians, who gives a fuck? Some have received some assistance from Iran. Is that like a repudiation of their morality, seriously? And also, when I'm talking about this alliance with the Stern gang and the Nazis, this is not to compare a relationship with Iran to one with the Axis, obviously. That would be a ridiculous and inept comparison. But the point here is just to show how easily these guilt by association arguments can be used against Zionists in like a far more damning way. I actually copied and pasted a little passage from Avi Schleim to substantiate my claims here, because that's what we do in the overzealots cinematic universe, where we pretty much, we back up what we say with historians. We differentiate ourselves from the destinies of the world. In 1939, the Irgun called off its campaign against the British mandatory authorities for the duration of the Second World War. Some of the more militant members of the Irgun, led by Abraham Stern, broke away to form a small underground movement, the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, better known as the Stern Gang. Stern saw Zionism as a national liberation movement and advocated an armed struggle as a means of independence, since he saw the British as foreign conquerors. He was unwilling to wait until the war against Nazi Germany was over before initiating the military revolt against the British occupation of Palestine. On the contrary, he made approaches to Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy in the belief that the enemy of our British enemy must be our friend. Stern's successor, a triumvirate consisting of Israel Eldad, Nathan Yellen Moore, and Yitzhak Shamir, who, by the way, went on to become a prime minister of Israel, continued to resort to terrorist attacks and political assassinations in their campaign to drive the British out of Palestine. After the war, they turned to the Soviet Union in the search for allies against Britain. That's Israel and Palestine by Avi Shlaim, chapter 19. Now, I don't think poorly of the Soviet Union, but something tells me that those who would defend Zionism today probably do, and probably would hold the ridiculous position that Soviets and Nazis were equally bad. So by your own logic of guilt by association, would you lambaste, I'm talking to the Redditor now, sorry. So by your own logic of guilt by association, would you lambaste the Zionists for seeking out an alliance with Nazis, Italian fascists, and Soviet communists? Again, I don't think poorly of the communists, but something tells me whoever made this chart does. Even then, I don't think it's fair to jump to the conclusion that these alliances or these potential alliances means that the groups involved share all of their goals. It means like political decisions were made and an alliance was fostered in service of some sort of political aim. It doesn't mean that everything is one for one. So it's just a stupid argument all around. And this line of argument will hold true later when we talk about Haj Amin al-Husseini, who is the Mufti of Palestine. You could see right here, a little further deeper on the iceberg, it says their founder of state was a Nazi collaborator. We'll talk about that later. But the crux of the argumentation that I just made holds true there as well. We're still on the fucking first one, goddamn. I'm a yapper, but you know what? That's what you guys tuned in for. When it comes to the supposed Palestinian alliance with Russia and China, both of those countries trade significantly with Israel, and they've both tacitly sided against the Palestinians in recent history. Both abstained from issuing their veto to stop Trump from like colonizing Gaza, right? Like that colonial Gaza plan that was brought to the Security Council last year. They both abstained from vetoing it. So whatever relationship is supposedly fostering between Palestinians and China or Russia it clearly isn't serious enough for either of the larger powers to stop Israeli-American aggression and colonialism against the Palestinians. Yapper zealots, yeah. All right. Hates the West. All right. Whatever, based. The West is this largest sponsor of terrorism worldwide, from the scramble for Africa to Sykes-Picot Agreement and like all of the realities on the ground that followed loosely in its vision, to the coups in Latin America and Africa and Asia and beyond. All right, they're mad at the West. Count me in. I'm mad too. Majority support for Hamas. Just a disclaimer, I'm obviously going to watch my language when talking about Hamas or any other group that my country deems terrorists, because it's illegal to support them in Canada. I don't know if you guys knew that. So with that said, the cinematic universe of overzealots denounces all terrorism and accepts uncritically my country's laws because the great chairman, Mark Carney, knows best. He just does. I'm here only to provide educational analysis, and I love the great chairman and banker, Marcus Carney. Marcus Carnage. Karl Marx. Marx Carney. So that's what we're doing. We are denouncing anything that my government wants me to denounce, because I love the Canadian government. They're so awesome. They do great stuff all the time. In seriousness. Now, okay. We're dealing with the majority support for Hamas argument. Support for Hamas fluctuates. Okay. If they are the group that's actually physically resisting Israeli domination, it makes sense that some Palestinians would feel stuck up for. It just does. That's like a human nature thing. Someone sticking up for you, you might have a proclivity towards them. But this is also a reductive claim because support is usually a plurality. Not that it would be necessarily wrong if it was a majority, given what I just said. But it also depends. Like if we're talking about Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank, those numbers fluctuate. So there's not this blanket Palestinian disapproval or approval for Hamas. There's also many times in history when support for, you guys are telling me to say H group. I don't know. Ugh, so stupid, but I'll do it to salvage the stream. Make sure it doesn't get clapped. There are many times in history when support for H group was low, specifically when the two-state solution and the peace process seemed like something that was viable, but Israel, acting as the intransigent party that it's always been, never took the peace process seriously. It was never serious about a Palestinian state. I mean, even their own dove leaders like Yitzhak Rabin admitted to the Knesset on October 5th, 1995, that he only ever planned to give the Palestinians something that was, quote, less than a state. That's the terminology he used. He made that in the thick of the Oslo peace process, 1995. Okay. Rabin also kept a Likud figure as the head of the Israeli delegation for peace negotiations with the Palestinians after he took over from Yitzhak Shamir, and after it was abundantly clear that Shamir and Likud were unserious about peace. This is detailed on page 178 and more broadly in chapter 15 of Avi Shlaim's 2009 book, Israel and Palestine. You guys really want me to skip all the way to the bottom and talk about Farfour the mouse? You gotta work your way up to that, brother. We're not going there yet. When I first learned about Farfour the mouse, that shit is kind of funny. I'm not gonna lie. Like I watched a couple of those videos. It catches you off guard. You're not going to expect what it is. Overzealots, do you condemn Hamas? Do you love Israel? Of course I do. Whatever my government tells me to do, I do. I accept it uncritically. Also, Ehud Barak, who was like another peace prime minister, he presided over the infamous Camp David and like the Tabet talks and the Clinton parameters. Ehud Barak, who was also a peace prime minister, built more settlements in his 2-year term, nearly 2-year term, than Benjamin Netanyahu did in the 3 years prior to him. In the 3 years prior, Benjamin Netanyahu, openly, uncontroversially a hawk and intransigent, built less settlements than the dove, Ehud Barak, as he was the one, rhetoric-wise, going the furthest with the peace process, okay? So the reason I'm telling you this, the point I'm making here, is that support for Hamas seems to fluctuate due to a myriad of factors, right? Including Israeli intransigence. I would say Israeli intransigence is chief among them. It's chief among them because, as I said, when the two-state solution, which is not something I am a fan of, by the way, I think it's unjust to force a partition on a native population, but when that seemed like it could be a viable solution, support for Hamas decreased. It's obviously something that operates, that exists dialectically. It's not a constant. If Israel is dead set, if it's dead set on precluding the Palestinians from achieving an equitable solution, armed resistance becomes inevitable. And I disavow it, Mark Carney, okay? I do. But this is a rule of thumb that even American presidents like John F. Kennedy understood. Even JFK understood this. So take it up with him, YouTube TOS and Mark Carney, if you have a problem with what I'm saying right now. Also, the PA, the operating Palestinian governance structure in the West Bank, is historically very corrupt. It was actually created specifically to outsource the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. So if you're a Palestinian and you see one group that's actively sticking up for you, saying at least, claiming at least, that they have your plight in mind, and then you see the PA who is collaborating with your occupiers, and then you see your occupiers who are relentless in their tormenting of you, is it that hard to say, okay, maybe support for the group that's actively putting up a fight could fluctuate? Is that hard to say? It's just so stupid. We look at Palestinian politics through this exoticized lens where they're not allowed to have these like internal political intricacies that we have in the West because they're barbaric or they're uncivilized or whatever. And this is shining through with this Iceberg tier list, right? I know these are very quick quips that if you just kind of throw on out there, you don't have someone to kind of dispel them or at the very least add additional context to them. It's easy to just take these racist talking points, internalize them, and start to think negatively of colonized peoples. So that's not what we're going to allow to happen today. Over my dead body, brother. There's also this passage from a leading expert on Hamas. His name's Khaled Khroub. This is from his book, Hamas, A Beginner's Guide. And he kind of like presents the politics of Gaza in a less orientalist light. Quoting now, the 60% victory that Hamas achieved in the PLC elections was not reflective of its clear-cut strength, but rather represented a coming together of two separate voting segments. This might be called genuine support and conjunctural support. Hamas's solid, genuine popularity is the constant support that it enjoys regardless of the fluctuations of the political situation. Either at the level of the conflict with Israel or in internal Palestinian affairs, the bedrock popularity of Hamas ranges between 30 and 40% of the entire Palestinian constituency. Any additional support to this share comes effectively from the conjunction of public reaction against the blunders and failures of Hamas's rivals, public frustration or outrage at ongoing humiliations from Israel, and the unforgivable corruption within. So pretty much just substantiating everything I just said. I'm from Tel Aviv and I dislike your stream. I'm sorry, brother. I gave my thoughts and prayers to the injured Israeli soldier at the beginning of the stream who ran into the anti-Semitic door hinge. That was horrible. That was so horrible. I felt so terrible for that person. Really sad to see. Should we pull it up once more? No, I'm going to be here all day if I fucking keep going on tangents. All right, let's move on to the next one. Countless of suicide bombings. Now, I don't purport to be the most grammatically correct person, but am I wrong to say that this is poor grammar? Wouldn't it be countless suicide bombings, not countless of suicide bombings? Am I wrong? Overzealots now banned from entering the UK due to verbal support. No. If there's two people whose words I have the utmost respect for, it's Keir Starmer over in the UK. I love what he does. I love how he runs my podcast co-host country. He does a great job. Queer Stalin over there. And Mark Carney, okay? I love Mark Carney. I love him. He's always right about everything he's ever said, and he's super based. People are telling me now to pull up the anti-Semitic door hinge. Fuck, guys, come on, guys. Okay, one sec. See what I do for you? I uproot the entire flow of the program for you. For those who missed it, this is the last time I'm showing this. This is the last time I'm showing this because it's truly hard to watch. It's sad to watch. This is somebody's child. This is somebody's 39-year-old child, okay? And you're laughing. Fuck, man. That's not funny. It's not funny. This door hinge is Hezbollah. I'm working on my Israeli accent. I feel like it's getting better. This door hinge no love Israel. Why this door hinge no love Israel? It's a shame. Get back to what we were doing. Where were we? Countless of suicide bombings. Okay, so the tactic of bombing civilian areas in Palestine, that was actually introduced by Zionist militant groups decades before Palestinian suicide bombings began. Decades before. Actually, like in the late 1930s, the Irgun and other Zionist terrorist groups would engage in the practice of placing bombs in crowded Arab markets and like buses and cafes. Even Zionist Israeli historian Benny Morris wrote in chapter 5 of his book, Righteous Victims, this is a quote, "The Arabs may well have learnt the value of terrorist bombings from the Jews." Benny Morris wrote that in Righteous Victims. And for those who may be confused as to why I'm emphasizing Benny Morris, he is a fanatical Zionist, despite the fact that he would call himself a liberal Zionist, a reasonable Zionist, which is, I guess, a testament to the fact that that seldom exists. Actually, it doesn't exist. Let's be real. It just doesn't exist. But Benny Morris, infamous for calling Israeli Arabs, which are Palestinians living in Israel, but he has a quote where he goes, "Israeli Arabs are a time bomb." He goes, "Their slide into complete Palestinization is imminent," something along those lines. And then he proceeds to call them a fifth column. A fifth column. When I'm editing this clip for YouTube, whenever I'm saying these things off the cuff, I will make sure that I substantiate what I'm saying with screenshot. So you know that I'm not just pulling shit out of my ass. I'm not pulling a Destiny. He also provided the prescription that things would be better for Israelis if only David Ben-Gurion, during 1948, during the Nakba, expelled all of the Palestinians. That's the prescription he provided. He supported Ariel Sharon's apartheid wall. He's praised Jabotinsky. But yeah, Benny Morris said that. The Arabs learned the value of terrorist bombings from the Jews. Also, modern Palestinian groups didn't adopt suicide bombings against civilians until 1994, and the tactic was explicitly introduced as a retaliatory measure. The first waves of these attacks, they were an explicit response to Jewish terrorist Baruch Goldstein's Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, which killed, I believe, like 29 people and injured a whole bunch of other people. It was only following this massacre that Hamas embraced like an eye for an eye deterrent strategy where they would target civilians in explicit retaliation for specific instances of Israelis targeting Palestinian civilians. Not a lot of people know this because nobody talks about it, but this is true, and I'll substantiate with sources as we go. Contrary to the popular narrative, Hamas repeatedly offered to stop targeting civilians and leave them completely out of hostilities, but Israel has rejected these terms. They've rejected time and time again. Hamas leaders, they've consistently stated as well that their attacks on Israeli civilians are strictly reciprocal, and they offered mutual armistice agreements to remove civilians from the conflict entirely. They've explicitly proposed that if Israel ordered its military and its settlers to stop killing Palestinian civilians and destroying their homes and arresting them and doing all of the shit that they do to them, then the Qassam brigades would confine their armed struggle strictly to Israeli military targets. Israel refused to respond or accept these offers. This can be substantiated on, what am I looking at right now? Page 246 of Khaled Hrub's book, Hamas, Political Thought and Practice. How long are you going to be streaming for, King? We've already done 43 minutes. I'm hoping I'll be done by around 2, because that is when my girlfriend will get back home from whatever appointment she's at right now. And then I gotta go to Sleep Country, get a new mattress. My hips don't lie, and they're hurting from the soft ass mattress I have right now. And I think we're gonna go for pho. Did I say that right? Is it pho or is it pho? It's pho. Hell yeah. That shit is good, man. I was sleeping on it. Overzealots is actually a real person. He's not an illusion on my little magical box. He has real life relationships. He does. And he's actually not a very serious person interpersonally. When he's chatting, he's not always just citing historians and stuff. I mean, I'm doing that right now because I want to substantiate the claims that I make while I'm debunking this iceberg. But in real life, he's a bit of a silly willy. Not a lot of people believe me when I tell them that if the only access they have to me is through my video essays. What subreddit is this from? r/political compass memes. Somebody just sent it to me via email. You better not end the stream before talking about the known Hamas leader, Farfour the Mouse. I showed my girlfriend Farfour the Mouse yesterday. She was shocked. shook. I guess it catches people off guard when they don't know anything about it, and then you just kind of show them a video. They're like, oh man, where were we? Countless of suicide bombings. Okay, yeah. Last thing I want to say about this is when we talk about suicide bombings, we also have to take into consideration the context in which they take place. Like, do you know how badly you have to push people down before they're willing to take a sacrifice like that, sacrifice their lives to fight back against oppression and occupation? There is a conversation to be had there, and Zionists never want to have it. They never want to have it. They just want to dehumanize the people who are pushed to their wits' end. Let's move on. Has death sentence for LGBTQ. This isn't true. This isn't true. And the laws between Gaza and the West Bank differ. The West Bank has actually decriminalized homosexuality in 1951, which is way before Israel decriminalized it. By the way, Israel stopped enforcing punishments for homosexuality in 63, but they didn't get around to formally decriminalizing it until 88. Yeah, that justifies yeah, exactly. I don't know. Some people genuinely believe, like, let's just accept this premise as true, even though it's not. I just told you it's not. But even if it was true, is bombing the daylights out of Gaza the way to answer for that? Is that the way to remedy that situation? It's a ridiculous line of logic. In Gaza, by the way, homosexuality is illegal under the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance of 1936, which means homosexuality wasn't criminalized in Gaza until the British made it so, and now Westerners point to a British criminal ordinance to highlight the supposed inferiority of Palestinians. This is pinkwashing. Yeah, exactly. I mean, people in Gaza, they're a little preoccupied at the moment, if you haven't noticed. Maybe a queer liberation movement would have flourished by now if Israel hadn't bombed and killed the people who could have led it. There are organizations in Palestine like Al-Cause that focus on LGBTQ advocacy. They exist, but Zionists can't incorporate them into their analysis because Zionist narratives rely on monolithizing Palestinians as this single hive-minded regressive bunch to justify genociding them. It's literal pinkwashing. 80% support for 710. All right, another disclaimer to appease the YouTube overlords and Chairman Carney. This is strictly political, analytical commentary, and I in no way support terrorism. Funnily enough, that's why I stand so firmly against Israel. With that out of the way, it makes sense that some members of a group hitherto beaten down for decades would agree with an operation, at least on some level, that inflicted a small fraction of the pain they've been subjected to onto their tormentors. That is just your human psyche. I don't think people understand the conditions in Gaza prior to October 7th. A lot of people just think it was totally fine, and the Palestinians, they screwed everything up. They did it for no reason. I have a video where I touched on the realities in Gaza prior to October 7th, and I want to actually pull that clip up. So give me 1 second, and we will watch this little clip. It should be only like a minute or two. All right. Zealot on zealot action. Yeah. No, I'm not playing the anti-Semitic door hinge again. IMO Bad Empanada said it well. It's hard for social progression to be widespread in a certain community if said community isn't allowed to reach freedom. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, they're a little preoccupied at the moment. That's not to say that, queer liberation is impossible. There's something innate in the Palestinian that precludes that. That's like a racist clash of civilizations narrative that Zionists need to rely on, because if they don't rely on it, then they have to start asking questions like, what could be preventing development in certain aspects here? Could it be the fact that we're bombing the daylights out of Gaza? Could that be why? The population in Gaza has been subjected to restrictions on movement, siege, blockade, and periodic killings for decades. Not to mention how so many people ended up in Gaza in the first place. The Gaza Strip is a region where Zionists crammed the Palestinian population who were ethnically cleansed from other parts of historical Palestine. It's common to hear Gaza characterized as an open-air prison, and this description is apt. Human rights organizations from Amnesty International to Israeli groups like Gisha have often stated that Gaza's population is subjected to collective punishment, which is a violation of international law. The economic devastation in Gaza is a direct result of Israeli policy, which controls everything that goes in, dictates how resources are managed, and blocks development. Note the date of this Gisha article. It came out months before October 7th, 2023. As economist and scholar Sarah Roy wrote, Israel has imposed quotas on the type and amount of raw materials that could enter the Gaza Strip for use in local manufacturing. Such quotas have particular significance for industry. They have enabled Israel to limit artificially the level of demand for and production of goods manufactured in the territories, thereby imposing clear structural constraints on the industrialization process. This segment is like Obama giving Obama a medal. Exports from Gaza are hardly enough to build up the economy, and there are little job. Ugh. I look a little disheveled in that. Of opportunities for the residents given they can't leave the Strip. Roy also notes how Israel imposed a one-way system of tariffs and duties on the importation of goods through its borders, leaving Israel for Gaza. However, no tariffs or other regulations applied. Thus, you'd make a pretty decent rapper. That's really funny because my job prior to YouTube was music. That's what I did. I made hip hop music and occasionally music for companies. Like I made this rap song for Smirnoff and then I was like in the commercial and I had to like make all of this instrumentation out of like sounds that I extracted from like this Smirnoff bottle because I don't know, they were selling like some product. Very capitalist of me to do. Also haram, alcohol, yuck. Anyways, we'll get into that later. For Israeli exports to Gaza, the Strip was treated as part of Israel. But for Gazan exports to Israel, the Strip was treated as a foreign entity subject to various non-tariff barriers. This placed Israel at a distinct advantage for trading and limited Gaza's access to Israeli and foreign markets. Gazans had no recourse against such policies, being totally unable to protect themselves with tariffs or exchange rate controls. Thus, they had to pay more for highly protected Israeli products than they would if they had some control over their own economy. On top of this, since 2007, Israel has maintained strict control over Gaza's airspace and territorial waters, having already demolished Gaza's international airport back in 2001. The World Bank back in 2015 put out a report that stated that the 2000... If you play your own music on the stream, will you get copyrighted? So if I play it right now, I could get copyrighted, but if I go through my distributor and I greenlight this second channel, then I'll be able to play it. But this Smirnoff song was distributed through their distributors and I don't have access to them. So if I played that Smirnoff song, maybe I would get copyrighted. But if I set everything up, I can get my distributor to give me access to play my own songs on stream just to preempt any questions because I guess people get kind of shocked when I tell them about this. Let me just show you. I haven't released a song in 2 years is the last time I released a song. I won't get into why I stopped the music because I've talked about it many times already. But yeah, here. Damn, some of these songs were kind of popping off a bit. Huh. Maybe I should get back into it, man. Fuck. I don't know. I don't really have it in me right now, to be honest. Sorry, I'm reminiscing. I'm reminiscing on the old days right now. Let's get back to the video. 54K listeners. I mean, I haven't released a song in like over 2 years, so it's gone down substantially. Does anybody here like rap? I've never really spoken with my audience about like hip hop. Like what kind of music you guys listen to? You are slimmer now. I am slimmer now. Thanks for noticing. I dropped 35 pounds in the past 6 months. Out of topic, but I appreciate how you mentioned Western Sahara in the No Politics Here podcast, so thank you. Of course. Solidarity with the people of Western Sahara, absolutely. I only listen to K-Dot because I love Kendrick. I love Mick Jenkins. I really liked Denzel Curry when I would listen more frequently. Sorry if I'm boring anybody who doesn't care about hip-hop. Let me just get back to the video. I'm on a tangent from a tangent. And 7 blockade on Gaza was responsible for shaving 50% off its GDP, with unemployment in Gaza being the highest in the world at 43% and youth unemployment at over 60%. According to UNCTAD, the decades-long Israeli policy on Gaza has hollowed out Gaza's economy and forced the population into a position of aid dependency. So when Mr. Brainworms over here says shit like,
the Palestinian people are arguably the most pampered people by international aid organizations in the history of the world.
Remember, this is a population that wants to be productive but has instead been deliberately de-developed and forced into dependence on international aid. Quoting from UNCTAD, between 2006 and 2022, Gaza's real GDP per capita shrank by 37%, while its share in the Palestinian economy contracted from 31% to 17.4%. The restrictions on movement also impede access to health and other essential services, as 80% of Gazans depend on international aid. Living in Gaza in 2022 meant confinement in one of the most densely populated spaces in the world, without electricity half the time, and without adequate access to clean water or a proper sewage system. It meant a 65% probability of being poor, 41% probability of dropping out of the labor force in despair, and for those looking for work, a 45% probability of being unemployed. As you've probably noticed, this UNCTAD reporting focuses primarily on the state of Palestinians in 2022, a year prior to when Zionists claim this all started. Okay, so let's put to bed that argument that October 7th came out of nowhere, that it was some irrational thing. Of course, I completely condemn. I listen to Mark Carney, the glorious chairman, no matter what he tells me to do. But to act as though it came out of nowhere is ridiculous. Keep in mind, Hamas offered to keep civilians out of the conflict. Israel turned that down. The Israeli government, they did deliberately use their own civilians as pawns against the Palestinians. They deliberately do that. And in many instances, Israeli civilians are fully on board with this arrangement. In the context of the Gaza envelope, which includes the settlements surrounding Gaza that were targeted on October 7th, these settlements, they serve the explicit purpose of acting as a colonial frontier against the Palestinians in Gaza. This has always been the purpose of these settlements in the Gaza envelope. And you can see Israeli figures all the way back in 1956, as early as 1956. You can see Moshe Dayan admitting that the function of these settlements is a colonial one. I have a quote from a speech he gave. He gave a eulogy in 1956 for a slain settler from Nahal Oz kibbutz, which is a settlement right outside of Gaza. And he said, "Early yesterday morning, Roy was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning dazzled him, and he did not see those waiting in ambush for him at the edge of the furrow. Let us not cast the blame on the murderers today. Why should we declare their burning hatred for us? For 8 years they have been sitting in their refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes we have been transforming the lands and the villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate. It's not among the Arabs in Gaza, but in our own midst that we must seek Roy's blood. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see, in all its brutality, the design of our generation? Have we forgotten that this group of young people dwelling at Nahal Oz is bearing the heavy gates of Gaza on its shoulders? Okay? Have we forgotten that the people dwelling at Nahal Oz are bearing the heavy gates of Gaza on their shoulders? That's what he said. He goes on to say, "Beyond the furrow of the border, a sea of hatred and desire for revenge is swelling, awaiting the day when serenity will dull our path, for the day when we will heed the ambassadors of malevolent hypocrisy who call upon us to lay down our arms. Roy's blood is crying out to us, and only to us from his torn body. We will make our reckoning with ourselves today. We are a generation that settles the land, and without the steel helmet and the cannon's maw, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a home. Let us not be deterred from seeing the loathing that is inflaming and filling the lives of the hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live around us. Let us not avert our eyes, lest our arms weaken. This is the fate of our generation. This is our life's choice, to be prepared and armed, strong and determined, lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down. The young Roy, who left Tel Aviv to build his home at the gates of Gaza, to be a wall for us, was blinded by the light in his heart, and he did not see the flash of the sword. The gates of Gaza weighed too heavily on his shoulders and overcame him." Okay? This is recounted in political economist Sarah Roy's The Gaza Strip. Her book is called The Gaza Strip. She recounts this eulogy. So the guy, Moshe Dayan, is literally saying, he's saying they are there to be a wall for us in the presence of Gaza. Okay, so this Zionist settler tactic significantly blurs the line between civilians and colonial agents, whether or not these Redditors are ready to admit it. Ultimately, Zionism is a death cult, and it's more than happy to sacrifice its own adherents for its colonial aims. This Iceberg is rage bait specifically for any anti-imperialist, real anti-imperialist. Dude, I know. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is so stupid. But you know what? People do believe this stuff, especially people who haven't spent years studying the topic. Where are we on this iceberg? Massacred every single person in villages they capture. True, yeah, there was this one harrowing instance of a village they captured in April of 1948 where they conducted a merciless massacre of the inhabitants inside. They killed the women, they killed the children, the elderly, and they did it all without discrimination, despite the fact that the village had a non-aggression pact with them. It was horrible, but the only thing is, it was the Zionists that did that, not the Palestinians. The Palestinians were the victims of that barbarity. The village was called Deir Yassin, and it was located in the area that the UN partition plan explicitly allotted to the international Jerusalem zone. But in seriousness, I don't know, there's not exactly the largest sample size here to confirm or deny this claim. If the Redditor is referring to October 7th, they'd still be wrong, because the whole point of that operation was to bring hostages back to Gaza so that they could be used to negotiate a release for all of the Palestinian hostages that Israel had been holding up until that point. I mean, Hamas even gave the command to Palestinian fighters to not commit war crimes or atrocities, and they invited an independent investigation to examine the accusations of Palestinian crimes on that day, but Israel blocked the investigation. They blocked it. This is not to say that war crimes didn't take place. They did, but the scale of which is largely unknown since Israel won't cooperate with an independent investigation while Hamas openly invites one.
In the West, only the Israeli narrative of that day is reported, that Israel was attacked and Israel had the right to resist, to defend itself. The Hamas narrative is never reported, and Hamas has issued a document with its narrative of the 7th of October. No one mentions it, and it's a very important document. It says strict instructions were given to the Hamas fighters only to attack military targets and not to attack civilians. We know that things got out of hand and atrocities were committed. We are willing to have the International Criminal Court or any independent body come and investigate what happened, and we will punish our people who disobeyed the orders. Contrast this position by Hamas with the Israeli position, which is not to allow any international journalists to go into Gaza, So the media cannot check for itself what's happening, what Israel is doing. And Israel refuses any independent international investigation of its actions. So here you have Hamas willing to have an impartial investigation of what happened on that day, and Israel completely not allowing access to the media, banning journalists from going into Gaza, and at the same time refusing to submit to any international audit.
Even that UN report on sexual violence for October 7th, the one that all of the pro-Israel types always cite, openly states that Israel blocked access to the relevant UN bodies that were tasked with investigating the scale and veracity of the accusations against Hamas. That report says that. Pay for slay. Pay for slay. I guess, okay, so if a Palestinian resistance fighter dies, then the PA pays social welfare to their families as a way to keep them afloat in the absence of their breadwinner. I think this is what this refers to. So Israel wants this practice to stop, but Palestinians see it as a way to ease the financial burden on the people who lost their providers in the struggle for Palestine. So I don't know, maybe if Israelis want this to stop, they should stop giving the Palestinians an occupation to fight. We could take it from there. Iranian and Russian proxy. Not a proxy, not a proxy. Palestinians act independently with some Iranian assistance in certain instances, but funnily enough, Iran was unaware that October 7th was going to happen and did not aid in planning or carrying it out, as is noted by US and Israeli intelligence. It's kind of a weird thing to do. If you're a proxy, you probably would have briefed each other on it. As for the guilt by Russian association, we've already been over that. What's up, zealots? Dude, come on, I'm not that old. I'm old, but I'm not that old. But yeah, okay, Iranian and Russian it's just bullshit. There are tons of disagreements between these groups. Russia trades significantly with Israel, but if the Palestinians were a Russian proxy, whatever that means, don't you think Russia would have stepped in to prevent Trump's colonial plan at the Security Council last year? It's just incoherent. Sold the land to Jews, then tried to take it back in war. All right, so by 1947, despite mass Jewish migration and Zionist aims to dispossess and economically subjugate and exclude Palestinians, Jews only owned less than 7% of the land. Therefore, the 77% of mandatory Palestine that Zionists obtained after the war was taken through force, okay? I mean, there were absentee Arab landlords who were approached by Zionists to sell their land to Jewish settlers, often behind the backs of the people who had lived there for generations and had a tacit understanding that they could remain in the villages regardless of any change in ownership. I mean, if you want to talk about Ottoman customs surrounding land ownership, it's probably something worth learning, right? Worth teaching people about if they don't know anything about it. So I know there's an excerpt in this Ilan Pappé book that does a pretty good, succinct job explaining the Ottoman customs surrounding the land ownership. This is from Ilan Pappé's book, A Very Short History, and he goes, settlers arrived in Palestine in 1882. They were able to buy land in Palestine with money provided by Jewish philanthropists and businessmen, such as the Rothschilds. The land they bought was mostly owned by absentee landlords, that is, rich people who lived outside of Palestine, who had purchased land from the Ottoman state after reforms in Ottoman land law in the mid-19th century. Before these reforms, individuals generally couldn't own land as private property in the Ottoman Empire. It was leased by the empire to landlords or farmers who built their villages on it. Many of these villages had been there for centuries. In Palestine, some of these villages even predated the existence of the empire. But under the new land regime, the village's land, previously leased from the state, was now the private property of a landlord. However, in the Ottoman understanding, the fact of land changing hands didn't alter anything in practical terms. The land, it was understood, came with the tenants attached, i.e. the villagers and their villages. This would change when the British rule commenced after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the end of the First World War. The Zionist movement appealed to the British rulers of Mandatory Palestine to disregard the Ottoman custom. They demanded that the British recognize that land ownership meant that they had the right to evict Palestinian villagers. Unsurprisingly, this did nothing but fuel anti-Zionist sentiment among Palestinians, and it led to resentment and outbreaks of violence against the dispossessors, like the attack on the settlement of Petah Tikva in 1886. It was carried out by Arab farmers who had been stripped of their land. But ultimately, the vast majority of the land that came under Jewish control was acquired through military conquest rather than land purchases, as is corroborated by the fact that only about 7% of the land was owned by Jewish people by the time of the partition, the supposed partition, the plan to partition. All right, so where are we now? Their founder of state was a Nazi collaborator. So this is obviously referring to Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti. The Mufti does not represent all Palestinians. He was a guy who was originally propped up by the British. He turned on them, and then he sought an alliance with the enemy of his enemy. So he felt that Britain was aiding the dispossession of his people, which it was, so he allied with Britain's enemy, the same way Abraham Stern tried to. His narrative also conveniently leaves out the fact that 12,000 Palestinians volunteered to fight the Nazis in World War II. And I was speaking to Chris about this point, because I made this point in one of our podcasts where I was like, yeah, you know, you point to the movie, but you never talk about the 12,000 Palestinians who teamed up with the British to fight the Nazis. And Chris brought up a good point. He goes, it says something that in order to highlight the goodwill of Palestinians, you have to align them with their dispossessors, with their colonial occupiers. And the British Empire was a repugnant empire. The crimes that the British Empire carried out, specifically in the Indian subcontinent, but not limited to that, all over the world really, were atrocious. Atrocious. So for people to only be receptive to Palestinians and their plight and see the humanity in them once you tie them to the colonial dispossessors that is Britain, there's something to be said there. There's something worth exploring there. Rejected 5 different state solutions, offered none. Wrong. Just wrong. The PLO accepted Security Council Resolution 242 and 338 in 1988, called for a Palestinian state on 67 borders in exchange for peace and recognition with Israel. 1988, I believe it was in Algeria, they accepted a 2-state solution and Security Council Resolutions 242, 338, all of the relevant ones. Again, I'm not here to defend the 2-state solution. I think it's silly. I think it's immoral to force a partition on a colonized people. But since this is the arena in which people want to have a discussion, I have to roll in the shit, okay? So if we're talking about the peace process, the quote-unquote peace process, and that's the premise we're operating on, then I'll have to accept it just to dismantle this argument, because even on their grounds, it falls short. The Arab League also proposed the 2002 peace initiative, I think that was in Beirut, which offered Israel a permanent peace and full normalization with the Arab states in exchange for a Palestinian state on 67 borders, and I believe like a capital in East Jerusalem. And Israel flat out rejected this offer. When it comes to Israel's supposed offers of a 2-state solution, fuck it, let's go through them. Let's go through them one by one and dispel the conventional Zionist myths surrounding them. Typically, Zionists will point to the 1937 Peel Commission as if it were a genuine 2-state proposal from the Israelis or whatever. It was the British who proposed that, but they'll point to that and they'll paint it as though it was like the first of many partition proposals that the Palestinians just rejected offhand. In reality, it was a proposal to give the Israeli settlers a mini-state in Palestine that encompassed the best quality lands, that could be corroborated by reading The Arabs: A History by Eugene Rogan, historian Eugene Rogan, and it came after years of Zionist subjugation and exclusion of Palestinians via instruments such as the Histadrut, which is their labor union federation that economically subjugated the Palestinians. 2-state solutions will never be upheld by Israel. It was never and will never be about compromise. Of course, this has been publicly admitted, right? As I mentioned earlier, Yitzhak Rabin, in the thick of the Oslo process, 1995, addressing the Knesset, he goes, "We're only giving the Palestinians, quote, less than a state. Less than a state." Ehud Barak, in his opening speech, his first speech when he was elected the peace prime minister in 1999, his first speech, he goes, "Under no circumstances are we withdrawing to the pre-67 borders." Shimon Peres, the co-architect of the Oslo peace process, he was in a meeting with, I think it was editors of Newsweek, and they asked, they're like, is the eventual outcome of Oslo supposed to be a Palestinian state? And you know what Shimon Peres says? He goes, no. Where were we? Back to the 1937 Peel Commission. That same year, 1937, David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Zionist settler movement in Palestine, he wrote a letter to his son where he openly admitted that his goal was to accept partition as like a stepping stone and then eventually abolish it so that the Zionists could come into what he called the possession of the land as a whole. That's what he wrote. He said that his plan explicitly was to abolish partition and come into the possession of the land as a whole. And to top it off, the Zionist leadership didn't even accept the Peel Commission. They formally rejected the plan because they wanted a bigger slice of the pie. What they did accept in 37 was the principle of partition, which is easy for them to do. It's not their homeland, and they only viewed it as a temporary measure until they could take over the whole land. Next typically comes this person said that there's 5. There was rejected 5 different 2-state solutions, offered none. I'm assuming the Peel Commission would be the first one that this moron is referring to. Second is most likely the 1947 partition proposal by the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, where the Jews, who made up less than a third of the population, owned less than 7% of the land, were offered more than half of Palestine, 56%. 56% accepted, well, nominally accepted and the Palestinians didn't. But let me read you this passage from historian Walid Khalidi pertaining to the 47 partition proposal. But it was not only the extent of the land allotted to the Jewish state that was at issue. The best lands were incorporated within it. Most of the fertile coastal plains from Jaffa to Haifa and all the interior plains from Haifa to Beisan and Tiberias. These included almost all the citrus and cereal producing areas. Half of the former and the vast bulk of the latter were owned by Palestinians. Citrus was the main export crop of the country, accounting before World War II for 80% of the total value of exports. As to cereals, Palestine had already been obliged to import about half its grain, thus alienating virtually the entire existing production areas of these two principal commodities from the predominantly agricultural Palestinian state to be, constituted by itself, an economic coup de grace. As if this were not enough, a full 40% of Palestinian industry and the major sources of the country's electrical supply fell within the envisioned Jewish state. That's what Walid Khalidi wrote, historian Walid Khalidi, when he was referring to the 47 partition plan, UNGA Resolution 181. I would pass on this shit too, sorry. So after this we get Oslo, which carved the West Bank into a barely contiguous batch of Palestinian enclaves encircled by Israeli settlers and military outposts. It also carved the West Bank into 3 areas, and the smallest of which was handed over to the Palestinian Authority, which Israel created to serve as collaborationist sellouts and carry out the occupation on Israel's behalf. Also, settlements more than doubled during the Oslo peace process, more than doubled, and they knew at this time that the settlements were a roadblock to peace. There's also the fact that, Rabin openly admitted he only wanted to give the Palestinians less than a state, I've mentioned twice already. In order to proceed with Oslo, Yasser Arafat reiterated his acceptance of Security Council Resolution 242, 338, and all of the relevant UN resolutions, and accepted a Palestinian state on the 67 borders and renounced violence. That was the prerequisite in order to start the Oslo process. He had to reiterate what he already accepted in 1988. So the fact that this moron is saying they rejected 5 different two-state solutions, offered none, that's not true. Yasser Arafat, as a prerequisite to engage in the Oslo process, which the Israelis sabotaged, had to accept a two-state solution. He had to as a prerequisite. Where are we? So we did the Peel Commission, did the 47, did Oslo. Okay, then we get Camp David, which Camp David was like a hastily put together summit to try and salvage the Oslo process. But Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister who presided over the Camp David summit in 2000, was arguably even less serious about peace than Rabin was. I've covered the peace process like so many times on my channels and podcasts, but I have this one segment from a video of mine, we're gonna react to overzealots again, where I talk about what Ehud offered. Serious question, what about the 2008 map from Omer? We will get to that, don't worry. Everybody loves to fucking bring up the Omer map. Even when land swaps were proposed, they were always lopsided and unfair. A prime example is Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's supposedly generous offer of 2000, where he wanted to formally annex illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory, offering Palestinians an extremely unequal deal in return. The ratio was roughly 9-1. Israel would get 9% of the already shrunken West Bank, including valuable areas, while Palestinians were offered just 1% of land within the Green Line, unspecified land at that. In addition to these unjust land swap proposals, Barak also wanted Israeli control over the fertile Jordan Valley, denying Palestinians the ability to control their own border with Jordan for 99 years. The UN affirmed right of return for Palestinians, stating that they can go back. Since none of this was written down, it's kind of hard to confirm if it was 99 years. It could have been 99 years. It could have been like 10. It wasn't written down, which is another testament to Barak's lack of sincerity. If you're going to fucking offer something and it's framed as this most extra generous offer, write the shit down. He wouldn't even meet with Yasser Arafat during the Camp David summit. So it's not exactly the most conducive behavior if you're genuinely looking for peace. Back to the homes that they were violently kicked out of was denied. The future Palestinian state was denied the ability to have a military. Illegal Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem weren't even up for discussion. Israel would keep control over Palestinian airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum. What the fuck is this? Keep in mind, this was framed as if it were the most generous offer imaginable. In reality, it only proves once again that whatever peace plans the Israelis have up their sleeves, they are not interested in a just solution. Another thing worth mentioning, peace, like they'll bring up peace a lot. They'll go, the Palestinians, they don't want peace. They don't want peace. What about justice? What about justice? Because there is a difference between peace and justice. You can have peace with the absence of justice. Is that something that we should be happy for? Is that something Palestinians should strive for? An unjust peace? Why is that never brought up? After the Camp David summit, the shitty offer that Barak kind of gave because he didn't really write it down. Then we get the Clinton parameters, which I've tackled many times as well since they're inextricably linked to the Camp David negotiations. They were Clinton's attempt to salvage the failure at Camp David earlier that same year. So you have a bunch of similar issues here, like the Palestinian state has to be non-militarized, settlements, they don't have to be dismantled in the West Bank. Let me just fucking pull up another video, goddammit.
After the Camp David summit of 2000 ended in failure, Bill Clinton tried to salvage the peace attempts with his Clinton parameters. Now, to be clear, Billy was in no way interested in genuine peace or a fair settlement for the Palestinians. Even Aaron David Miller, a U.S. negotiator during Camp David, admitted that America, for far too long, has been biased and acted as Israel's lawyer. Clinton was more so concerned with trying to cement a legacy for himself before the end of his presidential term, not with bringing justice to the Palestinians. The Clinton parameters were verbally presented in December of 2000 in the wake of the Second Intifada and just prior to the end of Clinton's presidency. These were U.S.-conceived bridging proposals meant to save the Camp David summit and lay the groundwork for a final deal. They weren't the result of joint negotiations, just America's idea of what a compromise might look like. However, they unfortunately failed to remedy the fundamental flaws that led to the failure of Camp David just months prior. Although the Clinton parameters were a bit more generous in regards to how much of their own land Palestinians were allotted in comparison to Camp David, and territorial continuity was given some lip service, Israel was still allowed to annex territory in which they had massive, illegal Israeli settlements. This would serve to legitimize those illegal settlements instead of abiding by international law and dismantling them. The parameters made it clear that Palestinians would have to give up their right of return to the homes and land they lost in 1948. In return, Israel would only acknowledge the moral and material suffering of the refugees, nothing more. The plan focused on resettling refugees in the new Palestinian state, keeping them in host countries like Lebanon or Syria, or sending them to other countries. Only a small number would be allowed to return to Israel itself, and even that would be entirely up to Israel. In effect, the Clinton parameters aimed to erase UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which states that the Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 have a right to return to their homes and property, or, if they choose, be compensated for what they lost. Clinton wanted the Palestinians to forget about that in exchange for, what, a token gesture of sympathy? The Palestinian state outlined in the parameters was meant to be non-militarized, yet Israel would have the right to deploy its forces into designated areas of Palestinian territory during a vaguely defined national security emergency, as well as maintain 3 military intelligence gathering facilities in the West Bank, a clause that seriously undermined Palestinian sovereignty. Nonetheless, instead of outright rejection, Yasser Arafat, acting on behalf of the Palestinian side, agreed to consider these parameters with reservations.
Okay, I just showed you that because I want you to see that the Clinton parameters still did not touch on the crux of the issue. The idea that Palestinians never offer like a counter offer or whatever is stupid. They consistently point to international law. They point to 242, they point to 338, they point to 194. They've already conceded 77% of mandatory Palestine. And now all they're doing is they're pointing to international law. The documents, not all of them, but 242, there's a real claim that was what they wanted, right? They wanted land for peace. They've been offered the peace and didn't give the land. So they never really cared for land for peace. They wanted the land. Regardless, Palestinians still accepted the Clinton parameters as a basis for future negotiations, right? So they didn't just offhandedly throw them aside. They didn't. Let me read you something from Charles Enderlin's book, Shattered Dreams, where he recounts a phone call between Clinton and Barack on January 2nd, 2001, just after Yasser Arafat agreed to proceed with Clinton's parameters. Barack tells Clinton, and I'm quoting now, "Arafat wants to extort an internationalization of the conflict and new concessions from the two of us. I have to tell my public the truth. I have no intention of concluding any accord before the elections." So, Barack openly states that he has no intention of taking this seriously, yet Arafat is the one who gets blamed? The talking points surrounding the Clinton parameters is that the Israelis and Palestinians, they have both agreed to proceed with reservations, but the reservations that the Palestinians presented fell outside the purview of the parameters, while the reservations that the Israelis presented were fine. They were totally fine. Now, fact, the Clinton parameters were originally concocted around like September or October, and Ehud Barak pressured Bill Clinton not to put them out until December 23rd, just a few weeks before both Clinton and Barack had to leave office for good. So Barack was aware, obviously, of the plan because he was the one telling Clinton not to put it out until close to the very end of the presidency. And Arafat, just 10 days after, accepted them. He also was engaging with the parameters when they were originally presented. He wrote this like big letter to Clinton saying, "Oh, I need clarification here. I need clarification here." You can substantiate that by reading Charles Enderlin's book, Shattered Dreams. He goes over it. He has a transcript of that letter. So no, the idea that the Palestinians just weren't taking it seriously is bullshit. In fact, Ehud Barak, after this whole ordeal, gave an interview to PBS where he essentially just stated, "Yeah, I wasn't taking it serious. I just wanted to show my constituents in Israel how these Palestinians are." That's what he said. Anyways, I'm probably missing some things about the Clinton parameters. I've talked about them so many times. I did a podcast with Chris, No Politic Here. It's called The Myth of Palestinian Rejectionism or something like that. If you guys want to go see like a full segment of us talking about the Clinton parameters and the Taba talks, which are the talks that were supposed to be predicated on the Clinton parameters, but they fell short because Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak left office. That's why that came to an end, not because of Palestinian intransigence. Okay. Typically after this point, so we did the 37 Peel Commission, we did 47, we did Oslo, and we did Camp David, Clinton parameters, Taba. We'll put those all in one. I guess the remaining one would be Omer's supposed peace proposal, as if that was serious in any regard. Avi Shlaim has a good passage about this in The Iron Wall. I'm just going to read that, guys. I'm sorry. I'm tired. Let me pull it up. Omer's main claim to be a peacemaker rested on an offer he made at his residence in Jerusalem to Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, on September 16th, 2008, 12 days before announcing his resignation. After leaving office, Omer made the offer public, claiming he had been willing to place the entire Old City under an international regime, divide Jerusalem, give the Palestinians 93.5% of the West Bank with one-to-one swaps for areas to be retained by Israel, and absorb 500,000 refugees inside the Green Line over a period of 5 years. This was certainly a far-reaching proposal which addressed all of the key permanent status issues on Jerusalem and borders. Omer went well beyond what Ehud Barak had been prepared to concede. Yet, Omer's version of events in the last moments of 2008 is not entirely accurate. By his own account, Omer demanded that Abbas meet him the very next day together with map experts in order to arrive at a final formula for the border between Palestine and Israel. Abbas asked to take the map with him to show his experts. Omer declined, fearing the map would be used not for closure, but as a starting point in future negotiations. I'm just going to take a break here from reading to touch on that. If you are a guy who is supposedly serious about solidifying this peace deal with your adversaries, first of all, why do you wait until you're already on the way out? Why do you wait until you're on the way out? Second of all, if it's this hastily put together thing where it's an all or nothing thing, you got to agree to it, time is running out, why would you not let the Palestinians take the map home to look at it? It affects them permanently, no? If this goes through, wouldn't that be a permanent solution? Don't you want to offer them the courtesy of at least taking the map home to look at it? Anyway, Omer declined, fearing the map would be used not for closure, but as a starting point in future negotiations, so he wouldn't get credit for it that way. That's what he really cared about. Abbas was not prepared to be rushed by the caretaker prime minister on a matter of such supreme importance, and no meeting took place the following day. Omer claimed that he never heard from Abbas again, and that the most generous offer in Israeli history remained without a Palestinian answer. But Omer and Abbas did negotiate subsequently on more than one occasion. Far from ignoring the offer, the Palestinians requested clarifications, which they did not receive. So Omer's fucking lying. He's full of shit. Palestinian doubts about Omer's credibility were compounded by his deep unpopularity at home and his imminent political demise. He was a lame duck prime minister, and his constitutional right to sign the agreement he proposed was wide open to challenge. Abbas was advised by some Israelis not to sign an agreement with Omer. Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister and number 2 in Kadima, which was the party, Omer's party, reportedly sent messages to Abbas urging him to wait for her to become prime minister and promising to improve on Omer's terms. Even without the added complications of internal Israeli rivalries, Omer's peace initiative faced an uncertain future. On a number of critical issues, the two sides remained apart. The Palestinians were not told whether Omer's percentages for the West Bank included or excluded the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, nor was there agreement on the West Bank settlements to be removed. Omer, for example, insisted on keeping Ariel, which extended nearly halfway across the West Bank, and this was not acceptable for the Palestinians. Omer stipulated that his armed forces remain in the future Palestinian state. This, too, was not acceptable to the Palestinians, obviously. Omer offered to admit 500,000 refugees into Israel in 5 years. Abbas wanted 150,000 to return over a period of 10 years. So even if his hold on power had been much firmer, it's far from certain that Omer could have reached an overall settlement. He later accused Abbas of lacking guts, of being indecisive, and of missing a unique opportunity for peace. But under the circumstances, the Palestinian leader's caution seems to have been at least partially justified. Page 796 of the 2014 edition of Avi Shleim's The Iron Wall. I know there was someone in here who was asking me to go over the narratives surrounding Omer, so there you go, guys. For those asking what section we're on rejected 5 different 2-state solutions, offered none. Anyways, you guys can see that the claim that Palestinians never offered a counteroffer is complete bullshit. I already mentioned this earlier, but they openly embrace Security Council Resolution 242, and they would point to it consistently as a basis for negotiations. They've already compromised to the point where they're giving away 77% of their homeland to foreign invaders. They're pointing to international law, and by pointing to international law, they are putting forward their counteroffer, which is already a substantial compromise. Thanks, Isaac. That answered my question. Of course, my friend. That's what we're here to do. Favorite Pokemon? Oh, that's a good question. I was talking to Chris about this yesterday. Psyduck is pretty fucking cool. I'm not gonna lie. He's funny. I like that he's always like fucking, shit, fuck. Like he's always annoyed. I like that. He's kind of like me a little bit. He gets a little frustrated and he's got a headache all the time. Maybe he's dealing with Zionists all day and that's what causes him to be like, oh, god damn it. Me for real. Why was Fidel Castro with Epstein? From my understanding, he was there because he was meeting with some politician and he was there to meet them, and then that person somehow brought Epstein there. But the idea that Fidel Castro and Epstein had some sort of good relationship, I mean, that's dispelled even by the Epstein files. You can see Epstein literally celebrating Fidel Castro's death in the Epstein files. He goes, now there's so many possibilities that could open up for us in Cuba. So there's a pretty good reason to be named in the Epstein files. Like, Epstein is celebrating your death and implying that you were an impediment to his endeavors, his wanted endeavors in your country. That's a pretty good reason to be in the Epstein files. Same with Finkelstein. I'm pretty sure he just said that he would strangle Epstein or something. Epstein had relations with literally everyone important. What matters is where they went and what they did. Yeah, of course. I mean, the Castro thing is such a stupid gotcha. Like, you just look at what Epstein said about Castro. He was like, fuck yeah, he's finally dead. We can do our evil shit now. Like, that's essentially what the email relayed. All right, back to the Iceberg. Tried to take over Jordan. I guess this refers to Black September in 1970, when like certain Palestinian factions clashed with the reactionary Jordanian government. Keep in mind, Jordan, by this point, had already colluded with the Zionists in 1947 and purposefully sabotaged the war effort in 1948 to ensure a Zionist victory. It had illegally annexed the West Bank in 1950 and was a collaborationist force. So, yeah, okay, I don't blame certain Palestinian factions for clashing with the Jordanian monarchy. I'll go out on a limb and say its hypothetical overthrow and replacement with like even a pan-Arab nationalist government would have been a significant improvement. I'll stand behind that. Based, never identified as Palestinian before 1967. Just wrong. It's just wrong. There was a distinct Palestinian national consciousness and like sense of patriotism developing in the early 20th century. There was even a Jaffa-based newspaper called Philistine, founded in 1911, and it regularly proclaimed its commitment to the idea of Palestine and Palestinian patriotism decades before 1967. There's also the fact that in the early 20th century, the Palestinian National Congress repeatedly expressed a desire for Palestinian statehood and pointed to the mandate for Iraq as a model. They demanded equal treatment with the mandate for Iraq. So the Iraqi mandate stated explicitly that Iraq would eventually be granted independence and become a nation state. And Palestinian leaders argued that that same principle should apply to Palestine. You can read more about this in Noor Masalah's Palestine, a 4,000-year history. But I mean, to say that there was no Palestinian national movement or they didn't identify with Palestinian before 67 just isn't true. That 1911 newspaper, Philistine, the fact that they would point to the national aspirations of the Iraqis and say we want equality with that mandate, and that mandate explicitly states that Iraq will become a nation state, it will be given independence. I believe it says something about giving it a parliamentary democracy. If you're pointing to that, those are national aspirations. You're using the name Palestine, you're asking for national aspirations, you're expressing your national aspirations, It's ridiculous to say that there was no such thing as a Palestinian identity before 67. Destroyed Lebanon. I don't know if this person is referring to the refugee crisis in Lebanon. I wonder how that happened, brother. Fuck. And if we're talking about destroying Lebanon, why not talk about Israel's illegal 1982 invasion, which was launched knowingly under false pretenses, right? They used the assassination of Shlomo Argov as the casus belli to invade Lebanon, when Shlomo Argov was assassinated by the Abu Nidal organization, which was an enemy faction, was enemy with Yasser Arafat's PLO. And the PLO at the time was already adhering to a year-long ceasefire that it had in place with Israel. So Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, all of those involved in the 82 Lebanon invasion, used the Argov assassination attempt in the UK to break the ceasefire that the Palestinians, the PLO, had been honoring hitherto. And then when the distinction was brought up to them, when people in their cabinet or people who would try to explain the distinction to them and say, hey, it wasn't actually the PLO who did this, it was Abu Nidal organization and their enemies. You know what Raphael Eitan and Menachem Begin said? They said, Abu Nidal, Abu Shmidal. We have to strike with the PLO. They go, they are all PLO. So this is knowingly false pretenses. They go in, they invade Lebanon in 82, and they stay there for 18 years. They occupy it for 18 years. And then they go back in 2006. They go back into Lebanon in 2006. I believe they stay there for 34 days, and they target civilians, civilian infrastructure in an effort to pressure Hezbollah to surrender. And that strategy of targeting civilian centers eventually gets used in future wars, specifically 2008's Cast Lead in Gaza, and it later comes to be dubbed the Dahiyya Doctrine. So if anyone's heard that term before, Dahiyya Doctrine, that's what it comes from. It comes from the Dahiyya suburb of Beirut in 2006, when the Israelis targeted indiscriminately civilians and centers of civilian power in an effort to pressure Hezbollah. I should have also mentioned the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which was again launched on false pretenses, is actually what created Hezbollah. The invasion in 82 and the 18-year occupation that followed is what created Hezbollah. and Hezbollah ultimately liberated the south of Lebanon in 2000, save for the Sheba Farms enclave, if you want to consider that Lebanese territory. I know Lebanon and Syria both agree that it's Lebanese, but Israel calls it Syrian. Whatever. I'm not here to litigate that. Funnily enough, actually, I think Assad said that the Sheba Farms was Syrian, but the Syrian foreign minister said that it was Lebanese. So it is kind of up in the air. I don't know. Regardless, Israel's occupying land that it shouldn't be occupying. Doesn't really matter. I think culturally, the Sheba Farms is Lebanese, right? Like the people there identify with Lebanon. Multiple Syrian politicians say that it's Lebanese. Lebanon calls it Lebanese. Israel is the one that calls it Syrian. Name invented by the Romans, can't pronounce the P in Palestine. The name Palestine and its various cognates has existed for more than a millennium before the Romans officially applied it to the region. What the Romans actually did was they elevated the pre-existing name into an official administrative title for an entire province, and they like meshed together a couple areas to form Syria Palestina. As for the PBF pronunciation argument, there's a creator, Human1011. He has a YouTube short, and he does a really good job explaining and debunking this argument. Because you'll hear this a lot, right? Like I can't be the only one who heard this, where it's like Arabic doesn't have the P sound. That's why they say B. That's why they say Bepsi, or that's why they say Philistine. What the fuck does that even have to do with anything? I'm pretty sure Italian doesn't have the letter K or J. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't have that. Does that mean juice doesn't exist in Italy? A fucking stupid argument.
An Israeli lawmaker once denied Arab history in Palestine because Arabic doesn't have the letter P. That might sound silly, but the claim has been resurfacing on social media lately, so is it true? No. In fact, it kind of proves the exact opposite. The claim is that Arabs can't be native to Palestine because they can't even pronounce it right. You see, in Arabic, there is no letter P. They pronounce it Philistine. To debunk that claim, let's look at a completely different example. Compare the word father in English with the word for father in other related languages. They look pretty similar. The only difference, though, is that F in English corresponds to P in other languages. At first, you might think that's just a coincidence, but it's not. Look at the word for foot, for example, or the word for fish. Consistently, English F corresponds to other languages P. All of these languages are related, which means they come from a common ancestor, and linguists believe that that original language had a P sound. Now, in most of the languages, they just inherited that P, but in the Germanic branch, which would eventually give us English, the P changed to an F. Well, the exact same thing happened to Arabic. Arabic is a Semitic language, and if we look across the Semitic languages at a word like mouth, for example, you'll see that where Arabic has an F, the other languages have a P. So linguists believe that in Old Arabic, like over 2,000 years ago, there actually was a P sound, but it went through that exact same sound change, where P changed to F. And there's plenty more evidence for this, by the way, like how the Greek names Pythagoras and Plato became Pythagoras and Aflatun. But here's where things get even crazier. P going to F was from Old Arabic, but in modern Arabic, whenever a word is borrowed that has the letter P, P is changed to B, which is why Pepsi and pizza become Bebsi and Pizza. So if Arabs pronounced Palestine as Palestine, then maybe you could argue it's a modern loan, but they don't. They pronounce it Philistine, which is proof that the word has existed in Arabic for millennia, old enough to be affected by the P to F sound change. Now maybe you're not convinced. You're thinking, if it really was the original name, it shouldn't have changed at all. Well, guess what? That logic also works against Israel. In modern Israeli Hebrew, Israel is typically pronounced something like Israel, but in biblical Hebrew, it was pronounced completely differently, something like Yithrael. So could I argue that Jewish people aren't indigenous to the land because they can't pronounce Israel right? No, that's a ridiculous argument. Languages are constantly changing and evolving, and regardless, the way in which a people pronounce a region has no bearing on whether or not they have a right to be there.
Yeah, bro, this guy was spitting. Fuck, I want to get him on the podcast though. What a legend. I think he's commented on one of my videos, so maybe I can. But this guy's a beauty. Anyways, take that, Redditor. Listen to my boy. He freaking laid you on your ass. What's next? Converted water pipes donated by the EU into rockets. This is, I've heard this talking point many times. It's meant to make it seem like Hamas is contributing to the lack of drinking water in Gaza by digging up functional pipes, functional water pipes, but no, like they do transform unused pipes and other scraps into rockets, but this Redditor and I would have very different understandings surrounding the morality of those actions, and that's all I can say about that. Right, Mark Carney? I love Mark Carney. I love all of the restraints that he has put on me. They're actually not restraints because I agree with them 100%. Only invention is the suicide vest. We've already tackled the suicide bombings argument earlier. As for the other half, this is just racism, right? Like I can Google Palestinian inventors and be greeted with some, right? Gazan mechanical engineer doesn't let blockade stop his inventions, right? So like that took literally one Google search. Gazan mechanical engineer doesn't let blockade stop his inventions. Invented a smart electronic necklace to improve social distancing to prevent the spread of COVID-19 infection. All right, let's see if there's any other ones. There's this engineer from the West Bank who invented a new model for miniature satellites. All right, this literally took me less than 5 minutes. Here we go. Sky's the limit. Inventor of the miniature satellite Palestine 1 from the West Bank. Cool. All right, so I don't know what to say, man. Yeah, Gaza has one of the highest educated populations for a refugee group. Spooky Scary Socialist is in the chat, and he's spitting. He's spitting. Big Triple S is in the chat. But yeah, I mean, I probably shouldn't even have taken this one seriously and tried to debunk it this way because it's so obviously just racism. Like, it's just a racist comment, right? It's nothing more than that. Okay, we're finally at the bottom tier. Holds the world record for most plane hijackings. This is untrue. There are factions like the PFLP. They did hijack some planes in the 60s and 70s to bring attention to their cause, but the Zionists actually beat them to this practice by pioneering plane hijackings as early as the 1950s. For example, it was 1954, Israel hijacked a Syrian civilian airliner, and they did it to capture hostages for a prisoner exchange. But again, like, this alone isn't enough for me to argue that Zionists are known for plane hijackings in the same way it's stupid to argue that Palestinians are. Supported Saddam Hussein while taking refuge in Kuwait. Fatah did. Yeah, Fatah did. And it was a bad political move that cost the PLO a lot of goodwill. The reason for Arafat's support for the invasion was that Saddam explicitly linked his occupation of Kuwait with Israel's occupation of Palestine and argued that he would withdraw from Kuwait if Israel was forced to withdraw from the territories it occupied and abide by Security Council Resolution 242. So, from Arafat's perspective, Saddam was sticking up for them. You know who did oppose Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, though? Hamas. So, it's worth mentioning. Far for the mouse. Far for the mouse. For those who have lives and are unaware, this is like a Mickey Mouse knockoff from a Palestinian TV show that people accuse of like radicalizing Palestinian youth. All I will say about this is, if you think this mouse character is what makes Palestinians hate their occupiers, you're a moron. They hate their occupiers because they don't want to be occupied. Mouse or no mouse. All right, guys, that will mark the end of the Iceberg segment.